Americans are already getting there, right? So, that being said, we'll move into the fun part of the presentation, which is that I'll give you all the news that's fit to print and some that's not about ASHRAE Standard 170. If you've heard me talk before or even caught the gist of what I'm saying so far, you know that I have been slightly critical of the air change table as a paradigm for our industry. This is a set of rules that we've been using for a long time, and mostly the reason that we're using these rules is because we've always been using these rules. Many of the numbers in this table are rules of thumb that date back to the 1960s. Some of the numbers in these tables are rules of thumb that date back to the 1860s, and that is unfortunately not a joke. The number 2 air changes per hour is the single most common number in the Standard 170 or Table 4A table, and that's a number that literally can be traced all the way back to 1877, just after Florence Nightingale did her sanitation reforms in the 1860s. And it wasn't a terribly scientific number back then. It was a rule of thumb for architects to put in natural ventilation. So we have this number that's been kicking around our codes for 140 years. And I, for one, advocate that I think a 2020 ASHRAE standard can do something a little better than that and can improve on that in some way. Before we dive down the rabbit hole of all the things that are getting considered within 170, we do have to mention that there are spaces within a hospital that the intent of the air controls has something to do with the clinical outcomes. If you grew up around ASHRAE, what you're probably thinking is that all those air change rates have to do with like bacterial control and disease vectors and all these fancy biological terms. Most of that is unsubstantiatable, but there are a couple places where it is. First off, operating rooms. We're doing sterile things in there, so we do need clean air in operating rooms. Second of all, protective environments, transplants, and they have lung transplant patients, and you're going to find protective environments. Those are legitimately clean spaces where you need to, reach a certain threshold. We do have bona fide sterile preparation areas in our hospital. Most recently, there's been this big trend to do compounding pharmacies in sterile environments, so those are sterile spaces. And then we do have airborne isolation spaces, both short-term and long-term. If somebody comes into a facility and it looks within the screening process like tuberculosis or smallpox or chickenpox, what we know are airborne diseases, then we put them into special spaces, isolation spaces that are held at negative pressure and exhausted 100%. And you'll notice on this slide that all of those have clinical citations. Those aren't ASHRAE citations, right? Those are all citations from medical groups and CDC. And the other thing that you would notice if you look around the international standards that every country in the developed world honors these principles, right? You're not going to find hospitals that are doing anything less than this. So the mythology of our standard really exists outside of those spaces, right? Oh, we got to have 4 air changes in the corridor and keep it at equal pressure because why? There's nothing behind a lot of that stuff. So since it is research night, I will talk about an ASHRAE research project. In 2015, ASHRAE and the FGI, Facilities Guidelines Institute, and ASHE, the Association for Healthcare Engineers, got together and they funded a research project to, quote, investigate the scientific evidence behind Standard 170. So they put a research team together and they took Standard 170 2013 and they found 887 requirements within the standard. And then they painstakingly went through and classified each one of them. And they called some of them rational, as in this is rational. We can explain this. They called some of them clinical, as in there's some medical organization that requires this standard. And then the rest of them they classified as in need of evidence. And then they went out and they talked to all of us and said, because some of you are sitting there going, oh, I swear I read a paper in a journal in like 1985 that said why we need the 4 air changes in the hallway. And so they found all those papers. They gathered 770 papers or something like that and tested all the all the requirements within the standard. And so this was presented in PowerPoint form at the last ASHRAE meeting. It is ASHRAE research, so one way, it's a giant spreadsheet and database, so they're having problems figuring out how to publish it. But one way or another, it'll be published, probably around January. The short version of it, though, is that about 3/4 of everything that we have within our standard is neither rational nor clinical, nor has any evidence to support it. Some of the requirements that do have some evidence to talk about, the evidence doesn't necessarily support the requirement. Right? So the evidence says 3 air changes and the requirement says 12. And then they found a lot of circular references, just people repeating things over and like the 2 air changes per hour thing. You know, they find a paper that says 2 air changes per hour. Might even cite another paper that says 2 air changes per hour, but it just goes back indefinitely, and you can't actually find the origin of any of that stuff. So that's ASHRAE research, and it's free for members. So any ASHRAE research project becomes free for members. Keep a lookout for that. The other piece of research that's going on, this slide definitely violates the commercialism policy, but this is state-funded research here in the state of California. California Energy Commission has funded, I'd call it the South Bay Project, but the real name is the Advanced HVAC Technology Demonstration Project for Energy Conservation in Hospitals. This is such a sexy name, but so what they're doing here is a performance ventilation system in a hospital, in a working hospital, and it's our South Bay Tower down in Long Beach, Pedro, and so that's the project team over there. Energy Commission is the funder, OSPOD is the approval agency, and the project team has come up with a list of contaminants of concern, and we're measuring the air quality within the hospital based on that list. Some of the measurement is boots on the ground measurement. They're bringing in a hygienist, and they're actually doing testing of the air quality. And then a good portion of the measurement are these sensor dongles that they've mounted throughout the facility. The sensors look like this. And so there's 77 locations of these sensors that are mounted throughout the facility. And the sensors have been installed for about 60 to 90 days, and so they are currently collecting data, which I've told the project team, you know, if that's all we get to with the state funding, then that in itself is revolutionary, because nobody's ever measured air quality in a U.S. hospital before. But the project plan is to measure air quality, continuously measure air quality over the course of those VAV conversions, and then ask the state for more money to keep going with that. But I've seen some of the first data off of those sensors, and it takes you back real fast to, you know, engineering school. And dilution ventilation is really just a conservation of mass equation. And so what happens is, like, you know, you think about CO2, the first bit of ventilation that you introduce to a space makes a big difference, you know, and you see like a big drop in contamination level. Then as you increase your ventilation, you sort of wind up on this asymptotic part of the curve, right, where you're kind of way out here. And particularly if your limit value is high and your sources are quite low and your ventilation rates are high, then you could be way out on that curve. At that point, you could drop ventilation rates 50% or 30% and really see a very marginal uptick in the contaminant level, right? And the data that we've seen so far definitely supports this as a hypothesis, right? Our contaminant sources are low, our ventilation rates are high. The particle numbers were almost unmeasurable, or a lot of them were unmeasurable, because we have two-pass filtration, you know, two-pass filtration in all these systems with a bunch of air changes through there, and you literally, the particles were zeroing out. And we said, well, there's a sensor error, and he says, no, you're just below the measurement threshold, man. Below that point, it's a step function. You get zeros. So it's a promising project, and there'll be more to come on this for sure. So all the things that are sort of happening within SSPC 170, the committee, you can come to those meetings. They meet 4 times a year. Anyone who wants to get involved, please do. We're having a good time at this point. The 2017 version came out, and I won't brag about the 2017 version. The goal of the 2017 version was to separate the standard into inpatient and outpatient and residential spaces, because everybody kind of knew that the table that we had for hospitals was not entirely appropriate for outpatient spaces and residential spaces. So the goal is to break the standard up into 3 tables. And it kind of did that because they broke up into 3 tables. I can't recommend that you spend $100 on the 2017 version, because you're just getting, you know, if you spent $50 for the 2013 version, then your price per table is significantly better than if you buy the 2017 version. But that's where we're at right now. But some of the proposals that they're looking at, the first one has to do with unoccupied turndown. There's kind of a recognition there that, first off, the language within the standard is not terribly concise right now. It's a little confusing. Where can we do unoccupied turndown? Where can't we do unoccupied turndown? So the committee is really working on that. Where should we be able to do unoccupied turndown? I talked about restrooms or staff areas or things like that. If we can get the code to be a lot clearer, then the idea would be to maximize the opportunities within there to do unoccupied turndown. It's really a lesson from lighting energy, right? Rule number 1 of lighting energy, you don't light empty rooms, and rule number 2 of lighting energy, you don't light empty rooms. And so we kind of got to learn from that. It's not rocket science, but it works. The other thing is outside air. 2 air changes per hour, obviously, that's the 140-year-old requirement based on nothing. And so what would we do as an alternative to that? Well, a lot of the European standards use a CFM per person basis or a CFM per square foot basis. ASHRAE standard 62 has the sort of double variable basis, CFM per person plus CFM per square foot. They're looking at multiple proposals right now. Standard 62 is looking at a proposal to add some outpatient healthcare spaces into standard 62. 170 doesn't like that, so they're saying, we want them all in 170. And so that sort of infighting is happening. I don't know where this one will land, whether it'll land. I would suspect that the outpatient ventilation rate procedure would come out of one of those 2 groups, within the next year or 18 months. And then the rest of it sort of snowball after that. Patient rooms, we always like to talk about air change rates in patient rooms. In California, we've had this rule in our books since the 90s that says that if you're using 100% outside air, that you can reduce the air change rates in patient rooms down to 2 air changes per hour. But the national standard doesn't recognize it, and they require 6 air changes per hour or 4 air changes per hour. And so there's a proposal in place to take that California rule and sort of adopt it nationally. And the committee's already rejected it once, and so this is round 2. Some of you might have been signatories. There was a web petition that went around a year. Yeah, remembers. There was a web petition a year and a half ago to sign it. Yeah, take the California energy rule and give it to the national standard. And so that's still under consideration. What's been interesting is they discovered that there were some states that, the 6 air change requirement, which really has a lot of energy associated to it, that only went into place in about 2001. And so they found some other states that just never adopted it and have been sitting at 2 air changes per hour the whole time. The big one was Wisconsin. And if you follow healthcare, Wisconsin's actually the leader in chilled beams because of that, because their code still said 2 air changes per hour. So they were putting in chilled beams all over the place without any code modifications. And of course, then the question is, well, when we changed everything to 6 air changes per hour, did all of our patient outcomes improve? No, they didn't. So it's still under consideration. And then there's the return of natural ventilation, or the alleged return of natural ventilation. I don't have terribly high hopes for this one, but in 2015, the committee put together a working group, and the working group published a position paper, SSPC 170 task group position paper on natural ventilation in healthcare facilities. That came out in 2017, and the short version of that is that they effectively concluded that there's no reason to continue to ban natural ventilation in U.S. hospitals. It obviously has a lot of precedent throughout the rest of the world, or in Europe. Natural ventilation is very common for ventilating hospitals. In Germany, it would be very common to just have an operable window or natural ventilation opening at the end of a hallway and then feed that out throughout a patient floor. And so there is a proposal in front of the committee to reintroduce natural ventilation in the U.S. standard. They would obviously prohibit it in a number of spaces that's listed there. You probably won't surprise you what spaces they want to prohibit. We don't want to do natural ventilation in operating rooms. And to me, that was obvious, but we're going to have to write that. Don't put natural ventilation. So the other big thing is filters. For many years, we've had a single standard for filters in healthcare spaces, kind of 2-pass filtration everywhere, right? Pre-filters, final filters. The final filters always have to be downstream of the coil, and that's been criticized. You really don't need the same level of filtration in an outpatient exam room that you have in an OR or a procedure suite. And so, again, about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, the committee put together a work group to start looking at those filter requirements on more of a space-by-space basis. And so the current proposal looks something like this. And a lot of the spaces would either drop down to single pass filtration or would drop kind of all the way down to standard 62 level filtration, right? In outpatient spaces, we really don't need anything better than we need in this room, and so those could change quite a bit. And that could actually affect our ability to select systems, particularly in the residential side. If you're in the residential healthcare units, that 2-pass filtration requirement has always been tough. You know, you want to do a window unit or something local to a long-term care facility, and that sort of prohibits that. So that could open up a bit. And then finally, operating rooms. Where we do want to do filters is in operating rooms. One of the interesting things that's happened in the European standards in the last 10 to 15 years is that the leading European standards have moved to validation of their operating rooms. So they're using ISO classes or colony forming unit, microbial counts to certify the operating rooms. And those are written into the standards. So the British standard, the German standard, the French standard. The French standard is the toughest in the world on operating rooms. So if you really believe that like clean air makes for good surgeries, go get your surgery in Paris. Because there's no ORs that are in the world that are cleaner than the French standard. But they actually validate it the same way we would validate a clean room, or where we're doing chip manufacturing or whatever we're doing in a clean room, pharmaceuticals. And so that's where the European standards have gone. We've gone there as an organization. Kaiser's doing this now. We adopted it about a year and a half ago, where we certify our ORs at ISO 6 and 10 CFU per meter cubed. So we obviously have the technology here in the U.S. to do the measurement and validate the clean rooms. And so the 170 committee is looking at an all and 10 CFU per meter cubed. So we obviously have the technology here in the U.S. to do the measurement and validate the clean rooms. And so the 170 committee is looking at an alternate compliance path where you could either do like the prescriptive 20 air change thing, or you could go to more of a performance method where you certify yourself out, and then maybe you have options to do different things with your OR ventilation system. The interesting thing in Europe is that once you go to a performance standard, laminar flow through a single large diffuser may not be the best solution, right? The sort of latest and greatest trendy system that's happening in Switzerland and Barcelona right now is this temperature-controlled airflow ventilation, where it's not a forced laminar flow ventilation system. It's more of a temperature, kind of a low-velocity temperature displacement system with a lot more filtration up at the units. And they're showing performance of that, that works out pretty well. So you can move away from that, sort of classic lots of velocity on the necks of the surgeons type of environment. So that was it. I wasn't going to talk for an hour, I swear. So I was going to put "Make America Great" at the bottom of the chart, but do we have time for